am Denise Deming. I am the host of this program for today, which is a role that I enjoy doing. And to host a program on such an important topic is also very, very pleasing to me. And when I think of the people who are participating in this discussion, we have brought persons from academia, we've brought someone from governance, and we have a practical person who's in the field as a farmer and planting and so on. So thank you very much. Just before we begin, there are some ground rules that we would really like you to obey. And those ground rules are, can you please mute your microphone because you're not speaking? And what happens if your microphone is open is any of the background noises that are occurring in your environment will come through to all of the participants, and we want to avoid that. So can you please mute your microphone unless you're speaking? I'm asking people on this occasion, can you just start the chat by telling us what your expectations are this evening, and then we'll be able to do very informal kind of check-in to see if we've met any of your expectations. The second point that I wish to make is that if you raise your hand to make a contribution, please be concise because we want it to be as interactive as possible. So let's use the chat. Let's have fun this evening. And I wish to begin our first presenter is Dr. Hussain. And Roger Hussain, I found it very interesting that I didn't know that he has authored 7 books. He's either authored or co-authored 7 books. And that is so important for our country because we need to really write about things that are important to us so that there is a legacy. Trinidad and Tobago is going to live for the rest of the world. As long as the world is around, Trinidad and Tobago is going to be here. And I'm sure that we're going to thrive, but we need to have a lot more stuff written formally. So Dr. Hussain, are you ready to make your presentation? Maybe you can unmute your mic and just press the presenter button at the bottom. That was well done. Thank you very much. So let's start, Dr. Hussain.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Denise, thank you for the introduction. So to use my 15 minutes wisely, I will start off by talking about something called the Phillips Curve. Now, the Phillips Curve, because I know there are quite a few students on as well, shows that there is an inverse relationship between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate. So as the unemployment rate falls, the inflation rate rises. And I will elaborate on that important point as we go along in different ways rather than just stick to a graph. The global economy, and certainly the Trinidad and Tobago economy in particular, may be said to, however, be suffering from something called stagflation, a rise in the unemployment rate alongside a rise in the inflation rate. Now, if you think about that, and to use simple language, if mankind becoming less employed and prices becoming more expensive, there is something to be worried about. So you're going in the market and you're unemployed, so you have less money, and the price of food going up, well, then there is pressure. And it's something to keep in mind. Now, I have explored extensively the presence of the Phillips Curve in Trinidad and Tobago, and I can't seem to, the data doesn't support the existence of the Phillips Curve, neither in the long run nor in the medium-term period. So something is occurring in the Trinidad and Tobago economy that influences the relationship between inflation and unemployment. And that's where the amount of energy revenues we collected is important. Now, here you would see total expenditure and inflation rate. You would see that as total expenditure increased, the inflation rate from 1999 to about, let's say 2014, remained moderately buoyant. But then as the total expenditure fell, the government practiced something called an internal devaluation, and you all could ask me about that later on. The unemployment rate fell. And this internal devaluation was part of a strategy, although Minister Imbert may not have written somewhere, I am practicing an internal devaluation. It was part of a strategy of controlling the inflation rate, in so doing to reduce the pace at which we became more externally competitive. Now, this diagram here simply shows the international price of some of the foods we import, fats, grains, and other foods. And as you could see, after 2019, the prices of these commodities, which we import, have been going up. So therefore, this will spill over into domestic price levels. And why it is important to look at the trend in food prices in particular is food prices has a very heavy weight in determining your overall price index. Food and non-alcoholic beverages account for 17.3% of the variation in our food basket. Now, if you look at the trend in food prices in relation to the core inflation rate, which is everything else except the food prices, then you would see food prices escalated between 1999 and 2021. And there are several people here on this seminar that could answer the following question that I ask on behalf of all the participants. How could we have allowed food prices to increase this dramatically when we had an energy boom, given that we know that is exactly what would have happened? In other words, how did we fall into the obvious trap? So that's one question that I'm asking. I'm getting the ball rolling. And here we see that as employment and agriculture falls, the food price inflation rate are increased, so that in other words, you produce less. And even though you see the green bars having a little upward movement after about 2012, note that if you follow the graph properly and the green bars are on the left-hand side measured, it never crossed 2%. In other words, agricultural output in Trinidad and Tobago for the period 1999 to 2020 never crossed 2%, and indeed it fell from about 2% in 1999 to about 0.3%, a significant fall in 2008. So, and I know Vasant Bharat is on, and I always was fascinated by one of the approaches he took to try to control food prices and to try to increase food production. So the obvious thing is, okay, if you have, food prices are increased, what segment, what element of food prices are increasing? So if you dig deeper, you would see vegetable prices and fruit prices are the aspect of food prices that increase the most over time. And therefore, to me, as a non-practicing agricultural person, but as an economist looking in from the outside, I would say, well, then I would advise people to grow more fruit and grow more vegetables locally. And in so doing, that would help me control the food price inflation rate. And here you see, I compared it to other countries. Trinidad and Tobago has a low agriculture, forestry, and fishing value added, the lowest amongst its peers. And it's not because of a high per capita GDP, because even Latvia, Seychelles, Slovak Republic, Greece, Lithuania, St. Kitts and Nevis, with much higher GDP per capita than Trinidad and Tobago, had higher agriculture, forestry, and fishing value added as a percent of GDP. So it is something else. Similarly, what this graph shows is that the more barrel of oil equivalent we produced in the horizontal axis is the lower our employment in agriculture. So somehow producing more oil pulled the workers out of the agricultural sector, and policymakers have to look at that carefully and see how that could be reversed. And one of the things that policymakers also have to keep in mind is that food imports increased and net official reserves increased for a long period of time together until about 2014. But then net official reserves fell and food imports remained buoyant, meaning that consumption has a built-in inertia, and therefore policymakers have to look at our food imports, given that our stock of reserves has fallen by about 5 billion and could even be about 6 billion, because some of it is more, because some of this is borrowed money. So we have to be careful about the food imports too quickly eating up our available stock of reserves. I also looked at if land size was an issue. And if you look at this diagram here, you would see that Trinidad and Tobago, there were countries with smaller land mass than Trinidad and Tobago that had higher agricultural value added as a percent of total output. Dominica, Maldives, Grenada, Sao Tome and Principe, Comoros, Mauritius, all those countries stand out. Then I also looked at population size, but there were many, many countries with a smaller population than Trinidad and Tobago that had a large agricultural sector. So you can't give me the land size argument, you can't give me the population size argument, you can't give me the GDP argument. So what then is the cause of the low level of agricultural output in Trinidad and Tobago? Now here I show the change in food imports. I just moved from big screen to small screen in order to see the label from 2008 to 2020. And you can see that food imports in Trinidad and Tobago increased 12% in that time period, whilst food imports increased, whilst GDP per capita fell, net official reserves fell, and the food prices rose. So we are buying even more food, even though we are getting poorer in terms of GDP per capita, and even though we have less reserves to support it in terms of net official reserve. So we definitely have something of a problem here that we need to look at. And food import per capita and GDP per capita US dollars, you will see that GDP per capita is falling, but food imports is not really falling as quickly. So in other words, the propensity to import food as a proportion of GDP per capita has increased. Now, all of this would make no sense. I mean, people could simply say, well, what are you telling me all of that for? If it is, we have strong export sectors that is experiencing upswings in international product cycle, well, then we are bothered. We could buy as much food as we want because we're making money in terms of foreign exchange. The truth is, I looked at the top 10 exports of Trinidad and Tobago, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 had strong comparative advantage. But what you found in the last column is that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 are retreat areas. In other words, the demand for them internationally is falling. And 1, 2, 3 are declining stars. Our production is falling. So we have something of an issue here. We cannot depend on exports and the dynamism of our exports to bail us out. I took the liberty of doing an analytical dive into what are some of the goods we import that we could import substitute. And I share it here. You all could look, you know, the PowerPoint would be available. But there are areas in which we could intervene and substitute some of our import food items. But what I consider to be the biggest problem in changing agricultural output, and I'm glad Leah Cataly is on, is that if you look at the first, second, third set of data here, you would see that agriculture share is falling. And if you look at the fifth set, you will see that labor productivity in agriculture is much lower than labor productivity in manufacturing and services. So that even if we were to put more workers in agriculture, the lower level of agricultural output means we would compromise total GDP. So how then do we increase output in agriculture and increase productivity? That is the million-dollar question we have to answer. How do we increase employment in the agricultural sector and increase labor productivity in agriculture? So 3 quick suggestions here. We should expand our social protection network because the rise in food prices would become more of an issue for the poorest household. But this social protection network have to be targeted at the poorest and most vulnerable, because this rise in food prices is going to squeeze them even more. To achieve long-term agricultural growth, the government should increase their medium and long-term investment in agricultural research and extension, rural infrastructure and market access for small farmers. And part of the problem with the food sector is the continued use of energy rents. I mean, I don't know how it is people like Leah Cat them just deal with this, but the continued dependence on energy rents means that we are shooting ourselves in our own foot, because the energy rents via transfers and subsidies reduce the amount of labor in agriculture, and by extension, therefore, create a problem in terms of agriculture value added. So we need to cut down on our transfers and subsidy. We need better long-range macroeconomic planning. This economy is in a very bad position, in my opinion. We need to build more on the Marura agro-processing park model, as agriculture itself is not very productive, but if we add value, we will make it more productive. Fruits and vegetables are the areas with the biggest increases in price. So we therefore need to support strategies that help to increase output in fruit and vegetables. And I would make a quick comment here that Dr. Gookool is the president of a group called the Shaw Foundation, of which I am a part, and several people on this chat are a part. And we have given out 1.1 million seedlings, many of which are in the category of vegetables. And therefore, I would urge Dr. Gookool and her group to continue. And finally, we have a lot of Venezuelan labor here. Why not make more meaningful use of the Venezuelan labor via a labor market strategy as it stands? And I have looked at the data myself. A significant part of the Venezuelans work in the non-tradable sector, which is very bad for the foreign exchange balance. And even worse, they work in the informal part of the non-tradable sector, so that their contribution don't get heavily transformed into GDP output. So given the, I know Denise is extremely competent and would like to stick to our time. So Denise, I took exactly 15 minutes and I would stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hussain. I really appreciate the fact that you've taken your 15 minutes and you've acknowledged that you've taken your 15 minutes. That was a really wide-ranging presentation. And I'm going to invite our next speaker, and our next speaker is Vasant Bharat. And one of the things I remember about Vasant, I don't know if it's a thing that he would be happy to be remembered for, is that while he was in government, he was a minister, our ease of doing business moved from 65 to 105. And I think we're back at 105. And to me, that was a significant achievement. And it is something that ought to be duplicated. But let's talk about Vasant. He went into politics in 2007, and he became the MP for St. Augustine. He has held various positions in various ministries. He's been the minister of various different ministries. And I think that the presentation we've heard from Dr. Hussain would give Vasant an opportunity to give us what is his perspective on some of the comments, some of the conclusions, or even some of the questions that Dr. Hussain has asked. So Vasant, while you unmute your mic, I invite you to let us hear what are your thoughts, given what has just been told to us for the last 15 minutes.
Thank you, Denise. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. We can hear you.
Good evening to everyone, and good evening to all those who are on the panel with me. Let me first say thank you for inviting me. I think it's a very important topic that we're discussing this evening. I'm not sure whether we're going to come to any meaningful conclusions and answers as to what will be done. I know we'll come up with a number of solutions what we should be doing, but what the policymakers will do is another issue. To say that I'm able to speak on this matter from two stands, having been Minister of Agriculture, Land and Food Production, and also Minister of Trade, which was somewhat a competing ministry, because of course the homegrown agricultural sector was competing, obviously, or are still competing with imported produce, and like I mentioned, to significant amounts of vegetables and fruits. So I can look at it from both sides, and this is where I want to make a comment that may be a little bit controversial, but we're talking about food prices here, But the reality is we are where we are today with regard to the agricultural sector and high food prices. And of course, granted that we know there are several issues that have caused prices to spike in the last 2 years. But we are where we are in the food sector, in the agricultural sector. We are where we are in many of the sectors in Trinidad and Tobago in terms of job creation, in terms of crime, in terms of healthcare, in terms of education, simply because we continue to practice a kind of politics. And I bring the word politics in here in a very broad way, Denise, simply because we practice a kind of politics in Trinidad and Tobago that does not always put the best people in the right places to make the right decisions on behalf of the citizens. And so you will find that we are continuously and constantly discussing issues and problems that confront us that we should have dealt with many, many years ago. But we didn't put things in place. We didn't have the vision. We didn't have the capacity. We didn't have the competence. We didn't have the people. Not that they didn't exist in our society. Of course they do. But they were not in the political arena, and they were not the decision makers that could have formulated policy and policies for the future. And until the citizens of this country understand and realize that when you continue to put people in positions that will make significant on behalf of you and your family and your children and grandchildren in future, and those people don't have the level of competence to make those decisions, we are going to end up in this kind of situation where we are discussing almost from an academic perspective what needs to be done. Okay? So I just wanted to contextualize what we're going to discuss this evening on the basis that unless we have policymakers who have the wherewithal to make the right decisions, not for the next year, not for the next local government election, not for the next general election, but for the country in the next 20 years, then we're going to continue to have this discussion, whether it's food prices, whether it's broken infrastructure, whether it's going to be jobs for young graduates. It's going to be the same. It's going to, whether people are dying truly because they contracted COVID, but would they have lived had we had a better healthcare system? All of these issues are going to be continually confronting the people of Trinidad and Tobago until we put the right people in the right place. So having said that, the reality with regard to the specific issue that we're discussing this evening is that we have two interconnected issues to deal with, two interconnected problems. One, of course, is the current price of food, which is extremely high. And that is largely due to the fact that Trinidad and Tobago has a high degree of what's called price transmission from the international markets to Trinidad and Tobago. We have a high degree of what's called price transmission. In other words, whatever they determine the price of a particular commodity is, they send it to Trinidad. We then add on the margins on that, and that's what gets transferred to the population via the importers and via the supermarkets and wholesalers. So if you were to go to any large grocery tomorrow morning, and I have done in the past, I would suggest to you that 80% at a minimum of the goods on every supermarket shelf is imported from outside of Trinidad. 80%. So, of course, clearly, whatever happens on the international market with regard to pricing is going to hurt us in direct proportion. The second issue and problem that's interconnected with this is, as Roger said as he was winding up, how do we deal with the long-term issue of producing more food, consuming more local produce, trading what we produce, and changing the palette of our citizenry by virtue of substituting imported products with locally grown. Those are the two issues we've got to deal with. But if we look back at why we are where we are today and why we are price takers, it's very simple. We have, over the last 50 years, decided that oil and gas was our way out. We decided at some point in time that we could make enough money to buy whatever food we require. And so therefore, the issue of developing the agricultural sector was never on the front burner, from government to government. Every government spoke a good, they spoke good words about what they were going to do with agriculture and food development once they got into office. But every government failed the people in developing a long-term vision. And I'm not here to blow my own trumpet, but in 2010, we started meaningfully to deal with the agricultural sector and the farmers, because we started to lay out a vision for the agricultural sector, not for the next year, not for the next 2 years, not for the next 10 years, but for the next 20 years. Because we felt if we could develop a culture, because you have to develop a culture, both in creating the palette and both in wanting to get people to work in the sector. You have to develop a culture until it becomes normal. If you just do it for a year or two and the person who's leading the charge disappears, well, of course, people revert to the previous status quo, because that's the most comfortable. But if you have your foot on the pedal for a period of time where what was difficult and uncomfortable becomes normal, then people are less likely to go back, right, to where they were. So very quickly, we developed what was called the National Food Action Plan. It's still on the ministry's website, okay? And in this plan, we did exactly what Rogers is talking about. We looked at import substitution for the areas where we felt we could have substituted. We identified, I'm just reading from here, staples, vegetables, fruits, aquaculture, livestock, and pulses. And we had identified specific staples: rice, dasheen, cassava, eddos, sweet potatoes, breadfruit, and so on. And we did the same thing for vegetables. We did the same thing for legumes. But it wasn't just pie in the sky where we just said we're going to do this. We identified also from 2013 right the way through from 2012 to 2015, every year, how much land was going to be set aside and where was that land located currently and how were we going to get it. And then we decided over a period of time, our current production is X, next year it's going to be Y, the following year it's going to be so, until it became a culture within the sector. And then, of course, we started to also support the agricultural sector in many ways. We revised the incentive program, which is here, made it much simpler. And very importantly, Denise, what we also did was we developed this brochure called Investment Opportunities in Agriculture. So it wasn't just letting them go and they had to strive to make it on their own. We were hand-holding them all the way through. And that's what's required with the agricultural sector now. It requires leadership which hand-holds the process, even spoon-feeds it, much of the same way that we did with Point Lisas in the early 70s and developed a world-class industry and world-class sector and developed export tradables. That's exactly what we need to do with agriculture. And I can talk a bit more, but I know my time has now run out and flies up. So those are my opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Vasant. And there's a whole lot of food for thought there and a lot of things that we can act upon. So let's we've moved from academia to governance. Let's move to a very practical side of it. Our next speaker is Mr. Liaquat Ali. And Mr. Ali, I was surprised when I looked at your CV. You are a former president of the Cuba Point Lisas Chamber of Commerce. You're involved in agriculture. You're the CEO and owner of Olmac Agro Supplies. You're the owner and CEO of Parboil. To me, that's rice. Parboil Trinidad. You're also the CEO and owner of Old Mac Guyana. And I found out that that company is located in the Essequibo, and it has a port that is directly linked to Trinidad so that rice can come from Trinidad. So those are the things that I found out about you. And I really look forward to hearing your response to some of the things that have been discussed here. So please unmute and let's hear your contribution.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to each and every one of us here tonight. And it's a pleasure to be here. And I must thank Dr. Hussein for inviting me at this forum. And Mr. Bhatt, I have your document here. So, I mean, 5 minutes is so short. I probably need about half an hour, probably next time. But I just want to touch on two areas of concern. I will speak about the rice industry after. I just want to touch in terms of escalating food prices. And not only food prices affecting this country, prices on every single commodity, whether it's hardware item, you name it, prices have been increasing tremendously over the last couple of years. And what is causing that, we know for a fact, is the freight costs. Freight costs have been probably 300–400% increase, because I'm importing. It was costing me about 3,000 US per container out of Thailand. Now is in the region of 12 to 15,000 US. So that is one of the factors in terms of escalating prices. Now, what happened, and I would have shared some information last night on the chat with respect to what Guyana did in terms of calculating the taxes based on your CIF value. Now, the CET is calculated based on the CIF value. And what Guyana did in August of last year is that because of the freight prices pre-pandemic, it was very low. And they went ahead and they allowed people to pay their taxes on the CIF, inclusive of the freight pre-pandemic, not the present freight. So immediately I had a reduction in the price of food item, whatever it was. And they allow, and even a couple of days ago in the Guyana budget, they announced that this practice will continue until the end of December 2022. And this is something that I think the authorities could look at and implement immediately. So there's an immediate effect in terms of reducing food prices. Now we would have different issues in terms of customs and port rental. Due to the pandemic, we have issues of delay in terms of getting your documents. And the port rental is an issue that we have. Sometimes you get 5 days, and beyond 5 days, you pay port rental. And those things we should look at the authorities to extend. If we could get port rental differ in terms of the number of days they allow you free, we have demurrage. That's another cause. So these are some of the factors that we could look immediately and see what can be done to bring the cost of goods down, especially food item. I know most of the food item probably not, most of them are zero rated, they don't attract taxes, but it have quite a few items that attract taxes and duties. And if they could look at the pre-pandemic freight and apply that to existing condition now. Another factor in terms of escalating prices is the availability of US dollars. People are forced to go on the black market and pay as much as $9 per US to pay for goods and services. And what that will pass on to the consumer. So those are some of the factors involved in why we are at this situation now, apart from food prices have been escalating worldwide. So I think the authorities probably have to look at that situation where the Guyana government implemented in August of last year. I don't know whether it had any level of CARICOM input, whether they had required approval from CARICOM to apply that, because if it probably might be unfair to the other countries that they are doing it. But the point is they're doing it for the benefit of the citizens of Guyana. And why can't we do the same thing in Trinidad and Tobago? Right, so that is just an area that I would like to touch on. Now I want to move on to my specialty, agriculture and the rice industry. I mean, most of you will probably know by now, recently we turned the sod for a parboiled rice mill in Trinidad and Tobago. And Dr. Hussein was privileged to look at my presentation when we met in Guyana. And I did a comprehensive report on the industry and where we can head within 3 years. Because we took a decision that we have to start to manufacture, we have to start to produce, we have to start to plant more, we have to feed ourselves in order to survive. And we took this decision that we want to do this exercise. We got the support of the government and the minister in terms of acquiring the land space available to set this mill up. Now, as it stands presently, we import 99.9% of the rice that we consume. And not only that, 100% of the parboiled rice that we consume. We produce no parboiled rice in Trinidad and Tobago for human consumption. We don't have a parboiled plant in Trinidad and Tobago, right? And Mr. Barrett, in his document, he would have indicated that he wanted to take the rice production to about 22% higher than where it was in 2012 to 2015. And probably I will ask the question now, Mr. Barrett, what happened to this plan between 2012 and 2015? And probably I will answer that later on in the session. So we are presently importing all the rice. What we did when I decided to launch into this investment is not a small investment. We decided that we have to help the farmers. And what we did, we started importing seed stock for the rice farmers in this country. We met with these rice farmers, we discussed it, and one of their problems they had was gathering seed stock to produce quality palm. I was able to access seed stock out of Guyana. We bought it in the country on more than one occasion, on several occasions. And what happened? You know what happened with these farmers? They were able to produce 50% more yields per acre on their production, using the same acreage, but 50% more rice. And they were all happy. So we entered into this large-scale investment, and we thought it was necessary to encourage the farmers. And we started that project. It's an ongoing, I mean, yes, it's taken a little bit long in accomplishing, but we already started working with the farmers. We recently formed a committee with people on my side, people on the ministry side, to look at the rice sector in Trinidad and Tobago. I know it's been dwindling year after year in terms of production. But I think within 3 years, we should be able to produce over 30% of the rice that we consume in Trinidad and Tobago. But it cannot be done alone. I need the support from the rice farmers and from the government. And we are heading into that direction. And I hope that this project could come on stream very soon as possible. We have some setback in terms of the pandemic, but this is just one area in the agricultural sector that we could look at, achieve it, and move to something else. And Mr. Barrett would have identified cassava and dasheen and his action plan. And that is, in my opinion, the direction that we have to take the agricultural sector. I know the ministry right now is looking into high-tech innovation in terms of greenhousing, where they could probably increase yield 10 times more than where it is. That is something we will probably be hearing about not far from now. But we have to be able to grow more food. I know Dr. Hussein and his Shore Foundation is doing a tremendous work in terms of handing out seedling. We have to grow more food, consume more locally grown food, so that we could be able to address the situation with food prices. It have a lot of more factors involved in what we can do. Time is so limited. I have a slide presentation on the rice industry. I think I would have invited Mr. Barrett to come and have a look. Roger was privileged to see this slide presentation on the rice industry in Trinidad and Tobago. And we can do it. Yes, we can do it. It's a huge investment. It's like a David fighting Goliath situation, but it could be done. So I know my time, probably 5 minutes, probably up. Somebody give me a signal, time up. So again, I could talk probably for another half an hour on the issue on agriculture, but on some other time. So thanks again.
Thank you very much, Leakat. And you know what, the thing that has stood out for me is you said that we import 100% of the parboiled rice and 99.9% of any other kind of rice. That means we have a real difficult situation. So thank you very much. Before we just go to some of the other questions that are here, Dr. Hussain, there's a question that came up on the chat, and I have a feeling that you are the most appropriate person to answer that question. And that is a question, it's a lovely question. It says, Dr. Hussain, are you there? All right, Doctor, yes.
I'm here, yes.
You're here, all right. It says, as an American living in Trinidad, I would like to know why I am paying American prices for food and goods. That is a really very important question. I wonder if you could tackle an answer to that.
Well, one of the obvious, so that has several reasons. Dependent on what type of food you are speaking about, there will be the fall in domestic labor argument, the low level of domestic production argument, and the low level of domestic productivity argument. Those things would translate in the context of high demand into high prices. And in terms of if it's an imported food, well, Vasant said it very clearly. We are an import-dependent nation, and as the price of food in the international marketplace rises, we bring it in, and we have to mark it up as well above that price level in order to sell it. So that the prices here, being a small importer, Trinidad and Tobago is a small importer as compared to, say, Nigeria or Pakistan or Mexico or Brazil. We are a small importer, and therefore we won't be able to buy extensive amounts, so that the per unit cost of items would be relatively high. And that's the type of reasons that account for high food prices here, apart from the very eloquently stated one that Vasant mentioned. I mean, if you are charging, and I prefer for Liaquat to repeat, on the wrong import source. I think he mentioned freight on board and CIF. I always mix them up. If you are charging on the inflated price, then the prices would be higher. And what he is saying when he referred to Guyana, I think that's a reasonable solution. And sometimes it baffles me. It baffles me that obvious things like that isn't done. So what we are basically doing is increasing the cost to the customer on an already elevated price. So that's my response to Andrew C., who asked the question in relation to the US, to the Trinidad and Tobago price level being higher than the US price level for some commodities.
Thank you very much. I want to move to Vasant and ask Vasant if you could make a recommendation to improve the agricultural sector, which means improving food prices. What would you suggest? What would be one thing you would do? You need to turn on your mic, please. Vasant, you're still muted. Lovely.
It can't just be one thing, Denise. It has to be several things. But the main things would be to ensure that you create an environment where farmers believe that this is long-term for them, and that you have to, and you create an industry and a sector that encourages young people, young entrepreneurs, young professionals to want to get involved in the sector, okay? And so therefore you professionalize the sector. But to do that, you have to create an environment where, the government has to create an environment where things work. So just two or three things quickly, I'll tell you. There's no security of tenure for many farmers, and you need security of tenure to go to the ADB or to go to a bank and get a loan. So that's out of the window for a young person who's now starting out. You still have gluts in the market. If a farmer produces a large quantity of tomatoes, or he's producing tomatoes and the price of tomatoes is $20 or $15 a pound, and 20 other people go and start to produce tomatoes, they flood the market, price goes to $2 a pound, the farmer busts, right? You have the issue of predial larceny. You have the issue of water, either too much water, it's flooding, or too little water and drought. You have infrastructural issues for access roads, for them to get into plant and for them to get their produce out. We talked in the roadmap committee about the use of technology, and I'm not necessarily talking here about greenhouse and so on. I'm talking about the use of technology which identifies which the physiology of the plant, determines the nutrients, when it gets it, what kind of nutrients it gets, rather than a blanket kind of just throw the kitchen sink at it. And it increases your yields tremendously. Liaquat mentioned something very important. The rice seeds from Guyana that were brought in that increased productivity by 50%. That can increase even further. It can increase by 100% because we had identified that certain strains and certain yields where we are getting currently 2 tons per acre that's being grown. You could get in Guyana, they're getting close to 4 tons. In other places, they're getting 4 tons. You know, so it's really the government laying out a vision for the sector and not just letting it go. You have to handhold it. You have to encourage the farmers. You have to increase consultation with them, and you have to get people to feel this is something that this country is serious about, and that's the only way it's going to happen. And because we've shown in the past that it's just full talk, and it sounds good on the budget statements and the manifestos, but that's where it all ends, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Vasant. And I just want to link what you're saying to some points that Liaquat made, because Liaquat raised 3 issues: that the tax on the CIF, the demurrage, and the cost of forex. All of those fall squarely on the government's lap. So is it, and I'm asking this question in general, is it that it will not change unless there is a change in government policy and government approach? Are you saying that citizens can't take responsibility for the agricultural sector and change it?
That to me?
That's to whoever wants to answer it.
Well, just very quickly. The reality is that it won't change with a change of government unless there is a focus on the sector specifically, and that you then put the right person to head that ministry. Ministers in the past always looked at agriculture as the lowest ministry in the rung on the ladder. When people were sent to agriculture, it was almost that they were demoted to the lowest end of the rung of the ladder. And until we can change that perception, until we can get the citizens of the country to understand and demand that we put the right people in these positions, and agriculture is just one of those sectors, but the sectors that are important to improving the quality of our lives, no matter which government is in, it's going to be the same. The focus has to change until, as I say, until the citizens demand it, it's not going to happen. But citizens on their own knees are not going to be able to ramp up the sector, create the infrastructure, create the ponds, introduce technology on a large scale. The point that Liaquat made with regard to even importing of chemicals and importing of fertilizers and importing of inputs. These things are taxed as well. And very importantly, the incentives that exist on the books, farmers take 2 and 3 years to be able to access these incentives because of the bureaucracy involved. You know, so government has a huge role to play in changing the mindset of the population to look at eating locally grown foods. Liaquat may remember that under my tenure as Minister of Agriculture, we introduced sweet potato fries in KFCs. And we did it in KFCs because we knew that's where children would go with their parents to buy KFC. And we figured if we could start changing the palate at that age, you know, by the time that young child becomes an adolescent, sweet potato and cassava fries would have replaced potato fries. Unfortunately, it lasted for about 6 or 8 months, maybe a year, and then it all fell apart as ministers changed and governments changed and the focus changed, and there we are. So,
can I invite Roger to unmute his mic?
Sorry, if I may make a comment, please.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I find it fascinating what Vasant just said. And that's such a brilliant idea. Now, I say this publicly. I find, and I think you made a little error about the ease of doing business, Denise. The ease of doing business improved under Vasant Bharat, as far as I can remember. A movement from 64 to 105 is a worsening. But as far as I can remember, and Vasant himself might be able to correct me, the ease of doing business did improve under Vasant, and he had a strategy where he looked at the 10 sectors and he tried to identify what were the obstacles and he tried to fix them. This either improved before 2014, it has to be before 2014, so he would comment. And two, look at the comment he just made about sweet potato fries. You call that win, 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 win. No loss. And how do you rationalize a program like that not still existing? And sometimes you would see me, Denise, making long, probing, almost vexatious comments. But it's when you hear things like that, it gets you almost vexed. Because this is a strategy that would increase employment, increase domestic production, increase domestic value added, reduce food imports, and yet still a change in minister or a change in whatever, and it has stopped. So it leaves the ordinary people like me, and I hope you, confused. I am confused now. Thank you.
Yes, I made a mistake. I think I mixed it up. So Vasant, here's your opportunity to correct what I said. But you have to put on your mic.
Yeah, one of the things when I became Minister of Trade, we realized that if we were going to encourage people to look at Trinidad and Tobago as a genuine investment decision, location and destination, we had to change the way we did business in Trinidad and Tobago. And that was right from the point where they had contact with a particular purchaser, and then subsequently when they arrived at the airport, how they were greeted by customs or immigration, and then of course the issue that Liak is happening with demurrage and ports and so on. And there are 10 indicators that the World Bank has determined that they will score how easy it is to do to trade in a particular country. And as you know, Denise, a lot of people who want to invest in a location, they don't normally have the time to pick themselves up, go on a plane and go on and check the country. So what they do is they go onto the World Bank website and other international organizations, and they look at different criteria. They look at crime rates, they look at how easy it is to do business, they look at productivity levels, they look at how easy it is to get their money out, they look at taxation regimes, all of these things they look at. And the ease of doing business, one of the things we worked out very quickly was that it took 72 days to start a business in Trinidad and Tobago, 72 days. So, and when you looked at elsewhere, Jamaica was 6 days, Singapore was 1 day, and so on and so forth. And there were other indicators. And we realized that we could start to tackle those indicators and tackle the underlying problems that caused those indicators to put us at 89, I think it was the time when I took over. We set ourselves a target that in 3 years, we're going to get to 50. Right, so the lower the number, the better, right? So we're at 105 now, which is terrible. But our thing was to get up to 50. And we actually moved from 89 to 62 when I left, and we were well on our way. In fact, in 2014, the World Bank wrote to the government of Trinidad and Tobago and praised us for being one of the top 10 movers as far as ease of doing business in the world. In the world. Okay, Trinidad and Tobago was one of the top 10 movers in ease of doing business because of the work that we'd done to remove a number of the bottlenecks and alleviate a lot of the problems. And we were able to bring, just as one of the factors, we were able to bring down how long it took to open a business from 72 days to 2 days. Okay, and I want to tell you, when I talk about creating cultures, when I first started on that particular exercise, it spanned several ministries, the Ministry of Trade, Ministry of Legal Affairs, where you have to go and get your name for the company, then the Ministry of Trade, then the Ministry of Finance, and so on. And each of these ministries operate in silos. But as you know, I was fortunate that I, on many occasions, was Minister of Finance, Minister of Trade, Minister of Consumer Affairs, and so on and so forth at the same time. So I was able to call all of the public servants and I said, this is what we're going to do. And when we started the process, they all said to me across the ministries, it cannot be movement. So we need all of these steps in the chain. We need every single one. And by the time we got through the process and we got down to 2 days, and I went back to all of the public servants and I said, now, how come we moved from 72 days to 2 days in this period, over a 3-week period? How is it we're able to, why is it that we weren't, why is it that you guys told me it couldn't be done? And said, because Minister, that's the way we always did it. Okay, and that's what I'm talking about, creating cultures. And we can create those cultures in every sphere of our life in Trinidad and Tobago until they become normal. I actually went to Parliament and put it into legislation those 2 days so that it couldn't be, it couldn't go backwards. So these things are not rocket science. They're not rocket science. They're simple. Other countries do them with less talent pool than we have. We just have to have the right people to drive the processes.
I just want to interject a little bit with respect to the sweet potato fries at KFC. What I can understand is that the government laid the platform for this thing to happen. And I think the private sector failed in terms of taking it forward, right? You already set the foundation, and you can't expect the government to continue doing something like this. And I think someone within the private sector should have saw an opportunity for investment or a business opportunity and grab it with both hands. I could agree with you that the school feeding program should have continued. That is where the government comes in terms of allowing it to continue. But with respect to KFC or wherever, it should have been done with coming from the private sector.
I just want to say something. Is my mic still on?
Yes.
Yeah, just very quickly in relation to that. The private sector will look to make the most money for the least amount of risk. That is the private sector wherever in the world you go, including Trinidad. If the risk is greater than the reward, in other words, if it is easier to import Irish potatoes, and they can import it by the container load, they get it coming at Point Lisas or in Port of Spain, they clear it, and it is in their factory, and they know they can get it every single Monday morning or every second Tuesday in every month, and the price is X, Y, Z. That is easier for them to do than it is to deal with 30 or 40 farmers who, if you tell them Monday morning, it not reached until Wednesday evening, and the price might go up depending on what is in the market. And that is where I say that that whole process requires hand-holding until you develop a culture amongst the farmers, until you can bring young professional farmers to get involved, to understand that creating a liaison, a business relationship with a large organization can build your own profile and build your own business over the long term. Whereas the existing farmers who are subsistence farmers, they've never had to deal with that kind of activity before. As I say, they've run their business, they've run their farms on cash, they've built their homes on cash because they were never able to professionalize their businesses. They don't understand. So government has to start to create the environment and hold it and handhold it for long enough until they can let go. If you let go and you say, okay, well, I'm no longer involved in this, let the farmers deal with KFC themselves, well, it's bound to fall apart. And that's exactly what happened. It just fell apart.
That is such a powerful statement that you've just made, Vasant, because when we look at the agriculture sector, if we are going to expand our tourism sector, then there are some backward linkages between the agriculture sector and tourism. So that we have to start from the agriculture sector before we could even start to think of tourism. Because people would come here and they want to come here and eat some of your local food, they want to understand, they want to really be part of the culture. But on that note as well, Vasant, it was Peter Drucker who said, culture will eat strategy for breakfast. So unless we do what you're talking about, which is to change the culture, then no strategy will really survive, and that culture change, I think, is really, really difficult. So thank you. There's a question that we have on the chat. As a matter of fact, this was a question, was direct message to me. And again, I'm going to throw it out to the panel. And the person asks, as the Trinidad and Tobago Central Bank anticipates to raise interest rates in the near future to curb rising inflation, should we see a decrease in food prices along with that change in the interest rates? So it's really a question of the relationship between the interest rates and increased food prices. Who would like to tackle that?
I think the economist is probably best.
That can go both ways. Are you hearing me?
Yes, we are.
Yeah, I read a comment by the central bank, and if you increase interest rates and you increase the cost of borrowing, and therefore prices rise on account of having to pass on the cost of borrowing, that could go both ways. So I would have to wait and see how that works out, because to be honest, I was a little surprised, especially given that the economy has rising unemployment. So that with rising unemployment, you want to widen capital space. So I would have to wait and see the outcome of that, Denise, to be able to say whether or not it worked. But I have my concerns.
Yes.
Right.
One of the potential. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Anthony, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add a comment here, and it has to do with the fact that if we compare two periods, the current period with the one in 2005 to 2007, we can see some important lessons here. In 2005, we had a similar rise in international prices, which was worldwide, and this was probably caused by some of the same things today, supply chain problems and production problems and so forth. And the economy was in expansion at that time because we had the gas boom and so on. And the government was very lax in terms of monetary and fiscal policy. So what you had was a massive expansion of prices. Prices rose above the international level about 360% as compared to prices in similar prices in Barbados. Barbados, which did not have the same monetary expansion or fiscal expansion, prices only rose about 68%. So in an economy that is expanding and where the government is also very lax, you're going to get a transmission rate which is going to be terribly high. In our current situation, we don't have that. And this is coming to answer the question about interest rates. We don't have an expansionary economy. The economy has grown for the last how many years? The economy has grown 1% or 2%. We're in a recession. In addition, the government is not in an expansionary mode. Fiscal policy has been reasonably moderate. They're trying to keep the lid on things, as Roger was saying. They're practicing an internal devaluation policy, so that you don't have the same kind of transmission. The transmission is not going to be as great. What you do have, which might be much more serious, is that you're in a situation where, as Roger was saying, unemployment is increasing, incomes are being lost, and people don't have, the government doesn't have the capacity, as it had in 2005, to really provide relief grants and food stamps and so on. In 2006, Mr. Manuel introduced the stamp card. So we're in a very, very difficult situation. And while I agree with everything that has been said here about improving agriculture, and we could talk a long time about a lot about this, in my view, the solution through agriculture is a long-term one. I think Mr. Bhatt quite wisely said that you're talking about 10, 20, 30 years of effort here to try to transform agriculture. You're not going to be solve the problem of rising food prices in the short run through agriculture. You just look at what Trinidad and Tobago imports, and you see how dependent we are on foreign food. We are terribly independent. There are some things, for example, which we don't touch at all here. We import 100%. So that my problem is, how do we overcome the short and medium term? How do we ensure that we could have social stability? How do we ensure that the people at the bottom of the ladder, who are going to be the people who would suffer from this, how do we ensure that they get a certain amount of income to be able to go for this period? So what I'm saying here is that we don't have the reserves, and Roger pointed this out earlier on. We don't have the fiscal space to really provide that kind of support that we had before. So we have to, in a way, to kind of look at alternatives, some sort of ways in which we could provide some measure of relief to the low-income households to be able to do this problem. Because we're going to have a fair amount of undernourishment, a fair amount of probably hunger going to emerge in the economy. Some of it is probably there, but it's probably going to grow. And these are the short to medium-term problems that I think we have to deal with. Now, I should say that this problem is essentially coming from outside, but to some extent inside because of our neglect of agriculture and all of the problems that we have over the years. But internationally, you have some people are waiting to see how far these prices will go. You may have probably supply chain problems, which could probably disappear in about 3 to 6 months. Some say it could probably even lesser time, which may to some extent lessen the impact of international prices. Because let's face it, it's international prices that are really causing the headache here, because we import almost everything. So I think we have to look at this question of how do we manage it in the short term. We have, for instance, what you might call temperate products being imported, and we have also to the local food production, the root crops and things like that. And the markets are here slightly different. Even under this present squeeze, for instance, we see a lot of imported temperate things which you could probably do without. In my view, I know these people get foreign exchange to import these things. They go to the government and say these are essential things that the government provide the foreign exchange. But I wonder to what extent we need to really continue importing a lot of these things. We don't absolutely need these things. They are much more essential things which we could focus on, which would be important for low-income households. So what I'm saying, and I don't want to take up too much time, I just want to point out that the problem, as I see it, is a short-term, medium-term problem. How do we manage this in the next 3 to 5 years? If international prices continue to go up, how do we handle that and avoid a kind of catastrophe in the low-income households? Thank you.
Prof, if I may just ask you, though, so are you in support of the central bank raising interest rates?
I don't see that as having any effect. To me, that is a non-issue, because when the central bank raises interest rates, so what? It means that people would invest less. That they have not an effect. We are dealing with something not in the realm of monetary or fiscal policy. It's no longer there. If we were in a situation of monetary expansion, if the government was spending a lot and you had inflation and so forth, then you could argue for higher interest rates.
Right.
So I agree. We're not in that situation. So I don't see what the impact interest rates would have on that. As I said before, in Manning time, that would have been important.
Yes. And
if he had raised the repo rate, he could have cut back a bit on the monetary expansion and the increase in demand that we were getting that was driving up prices here, are so high, and which actually caused the exchange rate to be inflated over time because prices went haywire after that. But I don't see monetary and fiscal policy as being a major problem here right now. I don't know if it may change next year or whatever it is, but right now I don't think it's a problem in terms of inflating demand for goods and services. The problem is much more supply one. The problem is much more what do we do internationally to curb that problem, and how do we use our resources to effectively and equitably distribute food to people who are in need of it.
But it's good that you mentioned the problem is a supply side one. And so the little channels through which the interest rate increase would adversely affect supply could probably worsen the situation. That's all so I agree with all you have said that it's a big structural problem. I was just a little surprised, me personally, to see the increase in interest rates at this point in time.
Yes, it would adversely affect people who want to invest in agriculture, for instance, if you want to raise interest rates at this particular point in time.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I have Dr. Tiwari raising his hand. So could you please unmute and make your comments, Dr. Tiwari? All right. In the absence of Dr. Tiwari, can I invite Kevin Bagaloo to unmute and make your comments or ask your questions?
Hi, good evening, everyone. And Denise, thank you very much for inviting me to this forum. It's very important. Dr. Hussein and Mr. Bharat, special good evening to both of you in particular. Dr. Hussein is always on point with regards to his presentation and what he has been saying over the years. Those who listen to him, because everything he would have said before is what is taking place now. And even certain points that Mr. Bharat would have made as well. I was hoping that groups such as the Supermarkets Association and so on would have been present here tonight because, you know, with regards to Dr. Hussein's presentation and the discussion, it is good for those sorts of groups to participate in these sort of things to have a better idea. Now, Mr. Bharat made a very good point about putting square pegs in round holes and so on. Well, I termed it like that, and that is a major problem we have in society. And Dr. Hussein explained everything via his presentation, which was well on point. Now, all the ideas that were given here tonight is well articulated. And my question to both Dr. Hussein and Mr. Bharat is this. You know, with respect to everything taking place and all these ideas, we know what is, what isn't. We know what we can do, how to resource, how to, you know, look outside of the box a bit, as Mr. Ali would have raised when he spoke about Guyana. How do we, you know, get, or what advice would you give those in authority to, you know, to consider the reality of this thing rather than standing in the public and, you know, portraying everything is good when basically everything that Dr. Hussein presented shows, you know, that we're not in a good place. And Mr. Gonzalez made a couple of good points. So my question is, how do we get them to, you know, at least listen or perhaps, you know, look outside the box and take some of these ideas into consideration before it gets too late?
Thank you very much. So who's going to tackle the answer to that question, Dr. Hussain? Would you do that?
Yeah. Can we see if we get Dr. Tiwari to raise his own so we deal with the two questions at once? I'm not sure if I suspect he is not hearing us.
Okay, but we can't do anything about that.
Right.
So can you go ahead and he will come in eventually.
Okay, so I agree with Kevin about his various comments, and I would respond in a generalized way. The data is clear. The data is clear in that we have, and Professor Gonzalez mentioned it, we have fallen per capita GDP, rising debt per capita. Debt per capita in Trinidad and Tobago was 35,000 in 2010. It's now about 110,000 per person. Rising unemployment rate, rising inflation rate. We are going to experience economic growth in 2022. Maybe not the 5.7% that the IMF said, but we are going to experience, let us say 3%. But it's going to come from the same sector, energy, that created all the problems that we are in now. And, you know, to intersperse that comment, the questions raised by Kevin with the state of the economy, what I find terrifying, and that's the only word that comes to my mind, is why isn't the Vasant Bharat approach, and I say this independently, and I say this all the time, nothing at all to Vasant being present here, because if he does something I don't like, I would also say it. Yeah, he knows that. Why can't we take the Vasant Bharat approach to the ease of doing business? Why can't we take the Vasant Bharat approach to improving agricultural output? Why? Why is there this tremendous reluctance to create change? Why is it that we are sitting down, Denise, and we would have had these same seminars for the last 5 years, let's say, so since 2016. And we would have talked like this, Liaquat, and we would have seen 2016 contract, 2017 contract, 2018 contract, 2019 contract. COVID only came in 2020. So I really get upset when I hear the ministers saying, well, because of COVID, we are in a situation. That's nonsense. And then we had COVID and the slide continued, but we are basically, I am praying as well that we are in the tail end of COVID-19. I hope nothing new comes along. Why doesn't the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago form a team led by the Prime Minister to improve the ease of doing business although it has been discontinued, the methodology is still there. And by about 40% within a 6 months period. Why? I don't understand. I don't understand why that isn't being done. And secondly, why don't we form an approach similar to what Vasant Bharat did? I remember in 2014, I'm almost sure it was, or 2013, he gave a lecture in this hotel in Laomi, and I can't remember, I think it's Paria Suites. And he very clearly, very methodologically, very scientifically outlined how we were going to increase domestic food production, why what items would be selected, and it is not being done. So my response then is, sorry, is more of a question, and I throw this question in particular out to elaborate on what Kevin said, and I throw it out to Vasant Liaquat and of course Professor Gonzalez, who we are fortunate to have on, to see if they can add anything further as to the why. Thank you.
Okay, and I'm not sure that they would give you the answer to that why, because the answer to that is a very complicated answer. I want to just bring a new voice into the conversation and invite Nafiza Mohammed, because your hand is up. Nafiza, could you unmic and tell us what is on your mind?
A very pleasant good evening. Assalamu alaikum and sitaram to your viewers and listeners. Denise, I was very heartened to be listening to this conversation. And as I think Roger Hussein just made mention of a 6-month period and some initiative, I think it is in sync with what Vasant was saying, I think, which has to do with leadership and vision. And the agriculture sector has really been a sector that has been neglected in many respects for many, many years. But I just wanted to share, and that is why I put up my hand, an experience that I had around the period 2006, when there was inflation, food price inflation was skyrocketing. I think it had reached something like 22 or 24%. And at the time, Mr. Ken Valley was the Minister of Trade and Industry. And I recall serving on a task force that had been established with critical stakeholders, including persons from the university, from the agriculture faculty, and the different agencies involved in agriculture. And within 6 months, those figures, that food price inflation figure, was brought down from that 22% down to 14%, because of a number of significant initiatives. I mean, the economists are there, but it's about demand and supply mainly. And we are hearing about increasing our agricultural output. But some of the initiatives, and I was glad to listen to Mr. Liaquat Ali, and when he broke down some of the cost factors that, that are involved with when you are importing food items and so. And it was always recognized that the transportation costs, bringing in goods from abroad, all these things have to go to Miami before it can come to Trinidad and what have you, and the charges would go up. So in an effort to help to reduce the gap between demand and supply, what had happened was that they identified 5 key food producing areas. And in a short space of time, because you had people, the agricultural extension officers and so involved, who went out in the field to identify some of the major factors that would have been affecting production, mainly the water management issues, because when it's rainy season, it's flood for the farmers, the risks involved in producing food, it is so high. They identified the infrastructural requirements for these 5 selected areas. And they're moving there with a team of people, with engineers, you name it, from whoever had the equipment and whatnot, and they went in. For example, a classic example was the Cunupia Farmers Association. And I think they became big in the dance with the production of sweet potatoes and so. And in no time, the production of food started to increase with these little initiatives that had been highlighted and going into these areas. Another big focal point had to do with market information, because the prices of food, and I mean, some places you go to some of the bigger supermarkets, the cost of basic items, vegetable items, it is so much higher than if you go to other places. So if you notice, at that time, there was a regular publication of the food prices in a random kind of way in supermarkets across the country and other places, markets and what have you. And in that way, it gives the consumers the opportunity to choose to go and purchase their food items where the prices were much better. So that market information, those things, those were some of the initiatives that helped. I just wanted to put that in the discussions so that we can learn from the lessons from way back then, because certain things did happen, and positive things in terms of increasing production to bridge the gap between the prices.
Thank you very much, Nafisa. And I'm very conscious of our time. We just have about 7 more minutes. And I wish to invite Dr. Tiwari. Do you have a comment you wish to make? Your hand is up. All right. Well, I'll move on then. We're about to wrap up. And I'll give Dr. Tiwari another chance. And while he's maybe getting his microphone unmuted, I just want to say to our 3 presenters that I'm going to begin with Liaquat to just give us some summary statements. Then I'll go to Vasant, and then we'll go to Roger before we wrap up. I think there's one issue that for me as a consumer, I've come to this conversation about food prices, and I'm leaving with there's a culture change that is needed before I can get any relief. That doesn't make me feel very happy at all. So, Liaquat, what are your wrap-up comments, or Dr. Tiwari? All right, so we'll go then to Liaquat. What are your wrap-up comments?
Okay, in closing, I would just like to say that the people involved in agriculture, don't give up. There's still hope. There's still light at the end of the tunnel. And we, as a population, must be able to grow more food locally and consume as much as we can locally produced food. And to the people out there who would like to see change in the agriculture sector, continue lobbying the authorities for change and just don't give up. We can't afford to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Don't give up. So I move on to Vasant. What are your wrap-up comments?
You mentioned culture change, and I talked a lot about it, Denise. It's culture change from both sides. Culture change from the angle of the consumer, who needs to understand the nutritional advantages of locally grown food, and also needs to have position in her mind by the authorities and the government why they should promote eating local food over imported. So it's a culture change from the consumer side, which does require governmental action in terms of campaigns they run from school level upwards, and also culture change from the government in terms of how they promote agriculture, so that there's a cultural change within the sector for young professionals to want to get involved. Just very briefly, Kevin asked about what the authority should be doing immediately. The 2 things I would do if I were in that position. The first is I would bring together a number of farmers who I believe to be competent, and NAMDEFCO has a list of certified farmers. Bring them in and understand from them how we can get their productivity levels up and how we can get them to access markets, because those are 2 issues. And I'm not saying the whole country. Bring together 50 farmers if we need to, and work with them to get their productivity up and to get them access to markets. And I would then, on the other side, I would bring together the Food Distributor Association, the importers, the wholesalers, the supermarkets, and have a serious discussion with them with regard to control of food prices, because whether we like it or not, there are 4 or 5 importers of food in this country, and they determine, unfortunately, monopolistically. It may be just part of how it happens, but the reality is that they control the food market. When I was Minister of Trade, I had brought these groups together to work out how we can control the price at which food came into the marketplace And so therefore, how it, obviously the different chains along, different markups along the route, how could we control that through? Because everybody says it's not my fault. The importer says it's not my fault. I'm a price taker. The distributor says it's not my fault. The supermarket says it's not my fault. But I think government needs to sit down with these people and understand what the real costs are and what the costs, the eventual cost to the consumer is, and pin the responsibility on that chain to make sure those prices are controlled.
Thank you very much. And Roger, what are your closing comments?
My closing comment has nothing to do with the topic, because I think it would be remiss of me not to say what a splendid job you did in managing this. From the way you managed the discussion platform in terms of the instruction, this is the first time I've stuck to my 15 minutes. And because I felt if I didn't, you would have a wand wave, a stick wave at me. And I think it was really, I am glad that Rebecca Gookool and Christiana on. These are the younger ones who do these things first. They can learn from your style and your frankness and your techniques. And I think it was really this was a really excellent session, even for me hearing from Vasant and as experienced a practitioner as Leakat, and of course with Professor Gonzalez always there offering these deep provoking arguments. It was an excellent session. So thank you very much to you, Denise. Thank you very much to Rebecca Gookool for coordinating, and for Christian Seeley for coordinating behind the scenes. These people do all the hard work, and we look forward in the future to chatting again with you all. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much to all our persons. It was 44 the last time I checked. We still have 44 people on this, meaning you've been here for an hour and a half, which means that the discussion has captured your interest, and we're very happy about that. Unfortunately, we don't have any big solutions. One of my big takeaways from this evening is that we need to start eating more locally produced stuff. And that is really very good. I grew up on locally produced food. I grew up on bhaji and plantain and sweet potato and so on. And somehow we changed our palate, and we have to redefine our palate so that we demand more locally produced food. Thank you very much, and all the best. Keep safe and make sure you're vaccinated. Good night.